Have you ever wondered why certain people come into your life at the exact moment they do? Why the heartbreak, the betrayal, the joy, the love, all seem to arrive just on cue? It's easy to dismiss it all as random, a chaotic shuffle of chances and coincidences. But what if it's not? What if your life isn't just happening to you? What if it's teaching you? Every conversation, every disappointment, every embrace, part of a silent curriculum, a path of the soul laid out long before you were even aware you were walking. You see, life doesn't hand us textbooks. There are no blackboards or class bells, but there are lessons, and the world is the classroom, and the people, they are our teachers. Some teach gently through kindness, encouragement, and love. Others, they teach through fire. They test your patience, your pride, your wounds. But whether it's the hand that lifts you or the one that breaks you, each leaves behind a message written not in words, but in awakening. In Buddhist wisdom, nothing happens outside the law of cause and effect, karma. The people who show up in your life are not strangers in the crowd of randomness. They are karmic invitations, reflections of something within you, or catalysts for something waiting to arise. And this is where it gets humbling. That boss who humiliates you, that friend who suddenly disappears, that lover who loves you one moment and ghosts the next, they're not villains, they're mirrors. Each one revealing a lesson your soul is ready, or perhaps desperate, to learn. Sometimes it's self-worth, sometimes forgiveness, sometimes it's the courage to walk away. Other times it's learning to stay even when it's uncomfortable. But either way, life doesn't make mistakes. It's not messy, it's mysterious. There's a Zen teaching that says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And the older you get, the more you realize the teachers were never in temples or robes or lecture halls. They were the people who hurt you, the people who challenged you, the people who stayed when you didn't deserve them, and the ones who left when you thought they never would. It's easy to love life when it's kind, but life teaches best when it's hard. Pain doesn't ask for permission, it just arrives. But underneath the ache, there's a doorway, a spiritual riddle wrapped in discomfort. Will you react or will you awaken? Because when we stop reacting and start reflecting, we stop blaming and start learning. We see the pattern behind the pain. We begin to realize life isn't punishing us, it's preparing us. And the best part, the lessons keep coming, not because life is cruel, but because the soul is infinite, and its potential is too vast to be contained in comfort. We grow through challenge, we deepen through loss, we rise when we fall consciously. In the Buddhist view, samsara, this cycle of birth, suffering, and death, isn't just about reincarnation. It's about our daily mental loops, the places where we resist change, the same arguments, the same fears, the same type of toxic love over and over again, until we learn, until we see the pattern, and finally until we break free. But we can't do that if we see life as meaningless. We can't awaken if we believe we're just victims of fate. Because here's the truth, you are both the student and the subject. And the universe, Buddha nature, karma, divine intelligence, call it what you will, has enrolled you in this school for a reason. You didn't come here to avoid pain. You came to understand it. You didn't come here to be untouched. You came to be transformed. And no one can do that work for you. Not your parents, not a guru, not even the Buddha himself. This path, this deeply human, beautifully imperfect path, is yours. So maybe it's time we stopped asking, why is this happening to me? And started asking, what is this trying to teach me? Because the curriculum is all around you, in the arguments you keep having, in the emotions that won't go away, in the silence that demands your attention. Every moment is sacred, every person is a pointer, and every difficulty is a doorway. Sometimes the first lesson life teaches is the hardest one to accept. that it was never about avoiding the storm. It was about learning to sit within it, still, silent, and awake, to let it wash over you and walk out wiser than you were before. That's where our journey begins. Not with answers, but with a question that changes everything. What if life isn't random, but brilliantly, painfully, and lovingly designed to awaken me? And once we begin to see life this way, we start to recognize the hidden wisdom behind the very thing we've spent our lives running from. Suffering. Let's go there next. Pain, nobody asks for it, nobody welcomes it, and yet, it's the one thing we all understand, intimately, universally, undeniably. But have you ever noticed something strange? That your greatest growth, your deepest clarity, your most meaningful transformation never came during the easy chapters of your life. No, they came during the breakups, during the loss, during the confusion. When everything you thought you knew collapsed and all you had left was you. That's not a coincidence. That's the curriculum. In comfort, we relax. In pain, we awaken. Comfort makes us feel safe even if we're sleepwalking. But pain shakes us. It pulls us from autopilot. It cracks open the shell we hide in. So something more honest, more awake, more real can be born. In Buddhist teaching, suffering dukkha is not a punishment. It's a signal. A message from the deeper layers of existence. You've outgrown this skin. You've clung too tightly to what cannot stay, and now it's time to evolve. But here's the thing, pain doesn't come with subtitles. It doesn't say, "This heartbreak is teaching you about impermanence." Or, "This anxiety is pointing to your attachment to control." No, it just hurts, and that's why most people run. They numb, they distract, they blame. They scroll endlessly through social media. Drink, work, date, eat, argue, anything to not feel. But avoidance is expensive, because what we refuse to feel, we repeat. And the lesson life whispers today becomes the scream we can't ignore tomorrow. That's why suffering is sacred. It strips away the layers we think we are. Our roles, our identities, our pride. Until we're left with the raw truth. Just this moment, just this breath, just this being. It brings us home to the heart of what the Buddha realized, that all conditioned things are impermanent, and that clinging to what must pass is the birthplace of suffering. So pain, in its harsh and honest way, is love in disguise. It tears down what's false, so truth can live. You see, comfort is sweet, but it doesn't reveal much. It soothes, but it doesn't shape. It gives us pleasure, but it rarely gives us wisdom. Pain, on the other hand, has no filter. It reveals what we really believe. It shows us who we really are when no one's watching. That's why your pain is a portal. If you have the courage to walk through it, not around it, you emerge not just healed, but transformed. And that's what makes pain the greatest spiritual teacher of all. Not because it's cruel, but because it doesn't let you pretend. There's a Zen parable that says, a student asked the master, "How do I get out of suffering?" The master replied, "You must go into it." That's the paradox. The way out is the way through. So when suffering knocks on your door, don't slam it shut. Don't curse it. Sit with it. Breathe with it. Listen to what it's trying to say. It may be asking you to let go, to forgive, to speak your truth, to stop clinging to an identity that no longer serves you, to stop living someone else's life. Whatever the message, it's always this: you're ready to evolve. But remember, suffering alone doesn't awaken us. Conscious suffering does. Pain that is met with mindfulness, with presence, with inquiry, becomes wisdom. But pain that is resisted, denied, or suppressed just becomes more pain. So the invitation is simple: don't waste your suffering. Don't run from the very thing that's trying to set you free. Use it, feel it, learn from it, and above all, let it open you. Because in the end, suffering is not the enemy, it's the mirror. And what it shows you, can either destroy you or liberate you. You get to choose. Maybe that's why the Buddha didn't promise us a life without suffering. He offered something deeper, a path through it, a way to transform it, a wisdom that includes pain, but is no longer bound by it. So the next time life gets heavy, the next time the ground falls out from beneath you, pause, feel the pain, name it, then ask, what is this trying to teach me that comfort never could? And you might just hear the quiet answer, echoing from the depths of your soul, this is how I wake up. Look closely, not at your phone, not at the news, not at the world outside. Look at the people around you, your family, your friends, your partner, even strangers. They're not just characters in the story of your life, they're mirrors. Every interaction, every emotion, every reaction. It's not just about them, it's a reflection of you. You see, relationships aren't random, they're revealing. They show us where we're healed and where we're still bleeding. Someone compliments you and you light up. Someone criticizes you and your defenses rise like fire. Why? Because people don't just talk to us, they trigger what's already inside. The Buddha taught that all things arise from the mind, that our experience of the world is shaped not by what we see, but by how we see. And nowhere is this more evident than in relationships. That annoying coworker, maybe they reflect your own suppressed ambition. That friend who's always late, maybe they challenge your craving for control. That person who loves you deeply, unconditionally, maybe they show you the part of yourself you forgot how to love. In this way, every person we meet, especially the difficult ones, becomes our teacher, not because they're right, not because they're perfect, but because they reveal something within us that we couldn't or wouldn't see on our own. That's why the people who irritate you the most are often your greatest spiritual allies. They force you to confront the shadow, the pride, the insecurity, the unmet wounds. And if you're willing to be honest, truly honest, you'll find that most of your emotional pain in relationships isn't caused by the other person. It's caused by the story your mind tells about them. They disrespected me. They never listen. They make me feel unworthy. But the truth is, no one can make you feel anything unless there's already a wound inside waiting to be touched. It's not their voice that hurts. It's the echo of something buried deep within you. And so, spiritual growth doesn't mean avoiding difficult people. It means letting them reveal the parts of you still trapped in illusion. The illusion that you're not enough. The illusion that love must be earned. The illusion that your worth depends on someone else's approval. Relationships strip away the mask. They show you where you're still pretending, still performing, still protecting your ego instead of opening your heart. And the most powerful transformation happens when you stop asking, why are they like this? And start asking, what in me is reacting this way? Because that's where freedom begins. When someone betrays you, do you become bitter or do you learn boundaries? When someone leaves, do you collapse or do you rediscover your inner strength? When someone triggers you, do you lash out or do you look inward? Every moment becomes a mirror, even love, especially love, because love, real love, isn't about getting what you want. It's about seeing who you are and who you become in the presence of another. Some people come into your life to show you joy. Some come to awaken pain. Some arrive to walk with you, and others just to wake you up. Not all relationships are meant to last, but every relationship is meant to teach. Teach you patience, teach you truth, teach you where you still cling, and where you're ready to let go. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part, that the world, in all its chaos and confusion, is still constantly helping you find your way back to yourself, through the faces, voices, and hearts of other people. So next time you're hurt, ask, what belief inside me has been touched? Next time you're triggered, ask, what is this showing me about me? Next time you feel judged, ask, am I the one who's still judging myself? Because when you start to use relationships as a mirror, you stop blaming and you start growing. This is the Buddhist path, not to escape others, but to awaken through them, to see that every soul you meet, friend or foe, is a reflection of the inner work you've yet to do, or the peace you've already found. So look again, not with judgment, not with fear, but with gratitude, because every person you meet is not just passing through your life. They are showing you the path back home to yourself. Let's be honest, some people feel like blessings. Their presence soothes us, their words lift us, their hearts embrace us. But others, some people feel like storms. They break our hearts, shatter our trust, test every ounce of our patience. And yet, the deepest paradox on the spiritual path is this: the people who hurt us the most are often the ones who teach us the most, not because pain is noble, not because betrayal is justified, but because suffering, when faced with awareness, becomes the fire that forges transformation. You see, anyone can teach you when life is gentle, but only the difficult ones, those who push your buttons, who trigger your wounds, who leave scars you never expected, can show you the places within yourself that still remain unhealed. Think about it. The friend who abandoned you revealed how deeply you fear being alone. The parent who criticized you exposed the roots of your need for validation. The lover who betrayed you shattered the illusion that happiness lives outside of you. And while your mind may scream, "They shouldn't have hurt me," the deeper question is, what part of me did their actions awaken? Because spiritual growth doesn't begin with blame. It begins with awareness. In Buddhist teachings, Mara, the tempter, the deceiver, wasn't a demon to be killed. He was a force to be understood. Likewise, difficult people aren't enemies. They're mirrors. They show us the grasping of ego, the poisons of attachment, the fire of aversion still burning in our hearts. And that fire is the real teacher, but only if we're willing to stay present with it. Most of us try to escape pain. We cut people out. We suppress emotions. We build walls. But in doing so, we miss the lesson. We miss the opportunity to see how hurt becomes awakening when held with compassion. Because here's the secret: the people who hurt you cannot harm your true nature. They can disturb your story, but not your soul. And the moment you stop seeing them as villains in your life story and start seeing them as teachers of your soul, everything changes. Hurt becomes humility. Rejection becomes redirection. Pain becomes purification. That doesn't mean you excuse abuse or tolerate disrespect. Buddhism teaches wise compassion, not blind forgiveness. But it does mean you stop carrying the weight of resentment like armor over your heart, because when you hold on to the pain, you relive the moment over and over again. But when you learn from the pain, you transcend it. That friend who lied to you taught you to trust your intuition. That partner who ghosted you reminded you that your worth doesn't depend on someone staying. That boss who disrespected you revealed your own hesitation to speak your truth. They didn't give you these gifts intentionally, but they gave them nonetheless. The question is, will you unwrap the lesson or keep cursing the package? Because the package is often ugly, tied with betrayal, wrapped in anger, sealed with silence. But inside is something sacred, a chance to evolve. And here's what few understand. Sometimes the soul makes agreements long before this life ever began. Agreements to meet, to clash, to hurt, so that something deeper could be born within you. Clarity, strength, liberation. The Dalai Lama once said, "In the practice of tolerance, one's enemy is the best teacher." Why? Because enemies trigger what your friends cannot. Your enemy exposes your ego. Your enemy confronts your pride. Your enemy reveals your limits, and then dares you to grow beyond them. And in that way, they become your most unexpected ally. So next time someone hurts you, don't just ask, "Why did they do this to me?" Ask also, "What is life trying to teach me through this?" Because the people who challenge us the most often awaken the most sacred truths. That real strength isn't in revenge, but in releasing the need for it. That real freedom isn't in control, but in surrendering what no longer serves. That real peace isn't in avoiding pain, but in understanding it. You don't have to love the people who hurt you, but you can learn from them. And in doing so, you reclaim your power, because no one can imprison your spirit unless you hand them the key. We all want to hold on to the people we love, to the moments we cherish, to the identities we've built, the dreams we've carried, the comfort we've known. But life has a different curriculum. It teaches us not by letting us keep, but by showing us how to let go. Everything we cling to will eventually slip through our fingers, and at first this feels like cruelty. A loved one dies, a relationship ends, a chapter closes before we're ready, our hearts break, our minds resist, and we whisper to the universe, "Why must everything I love leave?" But within that whisper lies the doorway to awakening. Because the truth is, impermanence is not a punishment, it's the most honest teacher we will ever meet. In Buddhism, it's called anicca, the law of impermanence. Everything that arises will pass away. No exception, not your beauty, not your youth, not your relationships, your fame, your possessions, or even your thoughts. And it's not because life is harsh. It's because life is alive. Nothing still stays still. The river flows, the petals fall, the sun sets. So what do we do with this truth? We stop clinging. We start appreciating. We stop grasping for control. We start surrendering to trust. Because the pain of loss isn't born from the loss itself, but from our resistance to it. We want permanence in an impermanent world. We want forever in a universe built on change. And so we suffer. But when we embrace impermanence, something extraordinary happens. We begin to live, not in fear but in reverence, not in attachment but in awe. We hold our loved ones closer, knowing they won't be here forever. We appreciate our youth, knowing time will take it. We show up fully in each moment because it will never return. And perhaps that's the point. Not to own life, but to experience it. Not to possess beauty, but to witness it. Not to escape endings, but to be transformed by them. Think of the lotus. It blooms radiant and proud. Then it withers. Then it returns to the mud. Is it less beautiful because it doesn't last? Or is it beautiful because it doesn't last? In Buddhist temples, monks meditate beside crumbling statues, burning incense that disappears into the air, chanting words that echo and fade. Why? To remember nothing stays, so be here now. Letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop imprisoning what you love. You stop demanding life to freeze for your comfort, and instead, you begin to dance with its rhythm. The death of a loved one doesn't end the love. It deepens it, it purifies it. It strips it of possession and reveals pure presence. The end of a relationship isn't a failure. It's a teaching about change, about identity, about who you are without what you've lost. In fact, every loss you've survived has refined you. Every goodbye carved space for a new hello. Every tear watered a deeper understanding. Every ending opened a door to a beginning you never expected. Impermanence is not the enemy, it's the architect of awakening. Without impermanence, there would be no compassion, no forgiveness, no beauty, no birth, no rebirth. Even pain is impermanent. Even grief changes shape. Even heartbreak eventually breathes into silence. So when life takes something from you, a person, a job, a dream, don't ask, "How do I get it back?" Ask instead, "What part of me is being asked to grow now that this chapter has ended?" Because you are not what you've lost. You are what you've learned. And the truth is, the art of living is the art of letting go, again and again, gently, bravely, compassionately, letting go of what was, so you can receive what is, letting go of what left, so you can find what's waiting, letting go of who you were, so you can meet who you're becoming. That is the heart of Dharma. Not clinging, not pushing, not fleeing, but being with what is, and letting it move through you like wind through a forest. You don't need to hold on to everything. You only need to stay awake for it. Because once you realize nothing lasts forever, you also realize nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. Have you ever been hurt, only to look back years later and whisper, "Thank you"? Have you ever lost something, a job, a relationship, a dream, and thought it was the end, only to discover it was the beginning? Life is rarely what it seems on the surface. What looks like misfortune might be a disguised blessing. What feels like punishment might be a divine invitation, but most of us miss it because we're too quick to judge what's good and what's bad, too eager to label every event as either a win or a loss. Yet the Dharma teaches us, don't trust appearances, look deeper. In the Zen tradition, there's a famous parable. A farmer's horse ran away. His neighbors cried, "What bad luck!" The farmer simply replied, "Maybe." The next day the horse returned, bringing with it 3 wild stallions. The neighbors exclaimed, "How wonderful!" Again the farmer said, "Maybe." Then the farmer's son tried to ride one of the wild horses and broke his leg. The neighbors gasped, "Oh no, how terrible!" And the farmer again said, "Maybe." Days later, the army came to recruit all able-bodied young men. His son was spared because of the injury. You see, what we perceive in the moment is only a fraction of the full picture. From the Buddhist view, everything that arises, joy or suffering, is not accidental. It is karmic. It is purposeful. It is here to teach, to shape, to awaken. But we won't see the hidden blessing if we're only focused on the outer layer. A betrayal might teach you self-respect. A failure might push you to your true path. A closed door might be the universe's way of saying, "That's not your way anymore." But we resist. We ask, "Why me?" We try to fix, fight, control. We cling to the visible form and miss the invisible grace. The lotus, again, is our greatest symbol. It rises from the mud, not despite the mud, but because of it. The beauty of the lotus cannot be separated from the darkness that nurtures it. Likewise, your growth cannot be separated from your pain. The people who rejected you, the moments that broke you, the seasons that felt like loss, they didn't destroy you. They refined you. They stripped away illusions. They burned false identities. They cracked open your heart, so something deeper could be born. When we look beyond appearances, we realize life is not happening to us. It is unfolding for us. Even the suffering, especially the suffering, because that's where the blessings hide. Beneath the layers of discomfort, ego, and control. In the Buddhist texts it is said, what appears as poison may be the medicine. You lost a friend, but found your boundaries. You lost a dream, but discovered your truth. You lost your way, but returned to yourself. And in that returning, you didn't just recover. You remembered who you really are. In this world of illusion, we must train the eye of wisdom, not the eye that sees appearances, but the one that sees meaning, not the eye that reacts, but the one that understands. This eye sees that the obstacle is part of the path, that the wound is where the light enters, that the delay is not a denial but divine timing. This eye sees that the person who irritates you may be revealing your deepest attachments, that the person who challenges you may be sharpening your strength, that the random encounter may hold a karmic thread from lifetimes ago. So next time you're faced with something you don't want, Pause, breathe, and ask, what is the lesson hidden here? What blessing am I not seeing yet? Don't rush to label it. Don't try to escape it. Just be present with it and let it unfold, because life is wise, wiser than your plans, wiser than your fears, wiser than your understanding. It's always giving you what your soul needs, even if your ego doesn't like it. And often, the greatest gifts arrive wrapped in discomfort. So trust the unseen hands shaping your path. Trust the hidden blessing behind the broken thing. Trust that what looks like the end might just be a sacred beginning, because one day you'll look back on the tears, the confusion, the detours, and say, now I understand. That was grace in disguise. That was a hidden blessing. Have you ever wondered why some lessons in life keep coming back? Why certain patterns, challenges, or relationships feel like a relentless echo, playing again and again in your life story? The answer lies in the deep currents beneath our everyday existence, in what Buddhism calls karma, the law of cause and effect. Karma is not a curse or a fate imposed from outside. It is a reflection of the seeds we have planted in this life or even lives before. Imagine your life as a vast garden. Each thought, word, and action is a seed. Some seeds grow into fragrant flowers, others into stubborn weeds. And just like in a garden, some plants bloom quickly, while others take time to sprout, waiting patiently beneath the soil. This is why certain lessons repeat. They are karmic seeds demanding our attention, not to punish, but to purify and awaken. But why do we resist? Because facing our karmic lessons means confronting parts of ourselves we often want to hide, the fears, attachments, and unresolved pain. We might ask, why do I attract the same kinds of people who hurt me? Why do I struggle with the same fears, the same anger, the same doubts? Why does history seem to repeat itself? The truth is, your soul is calling you to learn what you haven't yet understood. These repeated lessons are not mistakes. They are opportunities, sacred invitations to break free from old patterns. In the Buddhist tradition, the cycle of birth and rebirth, samsara, is fueled by unrecognized karma. Until we recognize and transform these karmic seeds, they will continue to sprout in our lives. But transformation is possible. Through mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, we can uproot the weeds, nurture the flowers, and change the entire landscape of our being. This is the curriculum of karma. It's tough, it's patient, it's relentless, and ultimately liberating. Think of it like a strict but loving teacher who won't let you graduate until you master the lesson. But here's the secret. Every time the lesson repeats, you get a new chance to see it more clearly, to respond more wisely, and to heal more deeply. You are not doomed to suffer the same patterns forever. With each awakening, the cycle loosens its grip. You begin to recognize your triggers without being controlled by them. You learn to respond instead of react. You find peace amid the chaos, and one day, the cycle ends, not because life becomes perfect, but because your understanding deepens, because you finally see the lesson was never about the external events. It was about you, about your heart, your mind, your freedom. Karma is not a prison. It is a path back to yourself, a path to liberation. So when the lesson repeats, don't despair, don't resist. Instead, bow to the teacher within. Thank the lesson for coming back, and open your heart to learn, because every repeated lesson is a step closer to awakening, to freedom, to peace. In the vast school of life, there is one quality more important than knowledge. It is humility. To become a true student, we must learn to let go of the illusion that we already know, that we are finished, complete, or above learning. Buddhism calls this beginner's mind shashin, a heart wide open, free from arrogance, ready to receive. It is the openness to see the world not as we want it to be, but as it truly is. Imagine a child's curiosity, their endless questions, their eagerness to explore. They don't carry the weight of ego, nor the defense of pride, to truly learn from life and from others. We must reclaim that childlike humility. Why? Because arrogance is the greatest barrier to growth. It blinds us to our flaws, shuts down new perspectives, and traps us in rigid views. In the Buddhist teachings, pride is one of the 3 poisons, along with greed and anger, that cloud the mind and keep us bound in suffering. But humility opens the door to freedom. When we embrace humility, we stop fighting the lessons. We stop resisting the teachers, even the difficult ones. We stop insisting that life conform to our desires. Instead, we listen. We watch, we learn, and with openness, miracles happen. We discover that every person, every situation, holds wisdom to teach us, if only we are willing to receive. In Zen stories, students often come seeking answers, only to be shown that the real teaching is in the experience itself, in the moment of openness, not in the words. Becoming the student means surrendering control. It means admitting, I don't know. It means trusting life's unfolding. It's uncomfortable at times because it asks us to be vulnerable, to face our shadows, to question long-held beliefs, to admit our mistakes. But that vulnerability is the soil where transformation grows. In humility, we find strength. In openness, we find connection. In being the student, we become the teacher of our own awakening. So the next time life challenges you, remember, the greatest wisdom often comes wrapped in humility. The greatest growth comes when you say, I don't have all the answers, but I am ready to learn. Because the moment you become a student again, you open the door to endless possibilities. You awaken the sacred dialogue between your heart and the world. You step deeper into the true meaning of life's school, and you begin to realize the greatest teacher you will ever have is your own humble heart. In the journey of life, not all teachers stand before us clearly. Some teach silently, invisibly, hidden in the corners of our experiences. These are the unseen teachers, the moments we overlook, the challenges we try to avoid, the people who cross our paths briefly but leave a lasting mark. Gratitude for these unseen teachers is a profound practice because awareness, mindful awareness, changes everything. When we become aware, we begin to see life not as random chaos, but as a perfectly woven tapestry of lessons. The difficult boss, the sudden loss, the painful mistake, all become teachers in disguise. They awaken something deep inside us, a subtle shift in perspective, a softening of the heart. Imagine walking through a forest with your eyes closed. You stumble and fall, confused and frustrated. But when you open your eyes, every tree, every rock, every sound becomes part of your guidance. Awareness is that opening of the eyes. It allows us to recognize the gifts hidden in discomfort, the patience born in waiting, the courage forged in fear, the compassion growing from pain. In Buddhist teachings, awareness is the path to liberation, vipassana, clear seeing. Through this clear seeing, we develop gratitude, not for what is easy, but for what truly teaches us who we are. Gratitude for the unseen teachers softens resistance. It transforms resentment into acceptance, and bitterness into wisdom. It's a radical shift, from victim to student, from suffering to growth. Practicing gratitude means turning toward life, even when it's hard. It means bowing deeply to every experience, knowing each one is a doorway to awakening. As the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh said, when you love someone, the best thing you can offer is your presence. When you are present, you can touch the wonders of life that are available in that moment. Gratitude opens the heart to presence, and presence reveals the teachers we never saw before. So today, Pause, breathe, look around with new eyes, thank the unseen teachers. Those silent guides who challenge, stretch, and transform you. Because awareness turns every moment into a lesson, and every lesson into a blessing. And in that blessing lies the true magic of life's school. After journeying through the vast and profound school of life, after embracing the lessons, the teachers, and the challenges, we arrive at a sacred moment, graduation. But this graduation is unlike any ceremony on earth. It's not marked by gowns or applause. It is marked by a quiet awakening within. To live with wisdom means to see clearly, to recognize the impermanence of all things, and to navigate life's currents with calm and clarity. To live with compassion means to open your heart, to others, to yourself, and to the world, with kindness that heals and connects. And to live with peace means to rest deeply, in the present moment, free from the chains of regret and worry, rooted in the stillness that is always available. This is the true graduation, a lifelong practice, a continual unfolding. Life remains a school, but now you walk its halls as both student and teacher. You carry your lessons not as burdens, but as treasures, tools for healing, growth, and awakening. Remember, the path is never perfect, but every step taken with mindfulness and heart brings you closer to freedom. As you move forward, may you live with open eyes and an open heart, embracing the sacred dance of life with gratitude and grace. If this journey resonated with you, if these teachings touched a part of your heart, I invite you to join our community of seekers here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe and walk with us on the path of awakening, where every lesson is a doorway, and every moment an opportunity for peace. May your life be filled with wisdom, compassion, and deep, enduring peace. Thank you for being here.